Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today I will be reading Harriet Tubman, Conductor on the Underground Railroad by Ann Petry. Foreword by Jason Reynolds, National Book Award finalist. I am going to start on Chapter 1, The Quarter. Chesapeake Bay forms the western boundary of the section of Maryland, which is sometimes called Tidewater, Maryland, sometimes called the Eastern Shore. Here there are so many coves and creeks, rivers, and small streams that the land areas are little more than heads or necks of land, almost surrounded by water. In these streams, the ebb and flow of the tide is visible for miles inland. Hence the name Tidewater, Maryland. In 1820, much of Eastern Shore was heavily wooded. The streams were filled with fish, game birds, wild duck, and snipe abounded in all of the coves and marshes. It could truly be said that every plantation thereabout at its garden gate has an oyster bed, a fishing bar, and a ducking blind. The plantation that belonged to Edward Brodus in Dorchester County was typically of this section of Maryland, for one of its land boundaries was a river, the Big Buck Water River. It was more or less isolated. The nearest village, Bucktown, was a little more than a settlement composed of post office, church, crossroads, store, and 8 or 10 dwelling houses. There was an air of leisure about the planters' life here. Fishing and hunting were integral, part of it, just as it had been part of the life of the Indians, who had practically disappeared from the Eastern Shore by 1750. The house in which Edward Brodus lived was very large. There had to be room for his friends, his relatives, as well as his family. Visitors came from long distances and so usually stayed a month or two before undertaking the journey back home. There were extra rooms for travelers who carried the proper letters of introduction, because inns and taverns offered uncertain lodging for the night. Edward Brodus was known as the master to his Negro slaves. His house, which the slaves called the Big House, stood near a country road. The kitchen was a small, detached building in the rear, known as the cookhouse. Not too far away from the Big House were the stables, where the riding horses and the carriage horses, the grooms, and the hostlers were housed. Close to the stables, where the kitchen gardens and the cutting gardens. Beyond these lay the orchards and the barns for the work horses and cows and mules. The big house, the cookhouse, the stables formed a complete unit. Beyond this lay the fields, the clear, cultivated land bordered by the forest. Out of sight, the big house, but not quite out of hearing, was the quarter. where the slaves lived. The quarter consisted of a group of one-room, windowless cabins. They were built of logs that had been cut from the nearby forest. The chinks were filled with mud. These roughen, I can't talk today, logs were filled with sap, and as they dried out, the wood contracting and expanding with changes in temperature, the roofs sagged. The walls buckled, the narrow clay damped chimneys leaned as though some unseen pressure were forcing them over. Seen from a distance, these sway-backed cabins seemed to huddle together as though for protection. The fact that they were exactly alike, that they were surrounded by the same barren, hard-packed earth, furthered the illusion. I apologize for that. I can't talk today. The cabins were exactly alike inside, too. There was a crude fireplace with one or two black iron pots standing in front of it. The hearth was merely in continuation of the dirt floor. When the wind blew hard, smoke came down the chimney into the room in puffs, so that the walls were smoke darkened. Even in summer, there was a characteristic smoky smell in the cabins. The fireplace was not only provided heat in winter, it was the source of light, and it was used for cooking. Piles of old, worn-out blankets served as beds. There were no chairs, so the occupants of the cabins either squatted in front of the fireplace or sat on the floor. In the middle of the dirt floor, there was a large, fairly deep hole covered over with loose boards. This was the potato hole, where sweet potatoes were stored in winter to protect them from the frost. Harriet Greeny, I'm not for sure how to say that name, who was usually called Old Rip, and her husband, Benjamin Ross, both slaves, lived in one of these windowless cabins in the quarter on the Broadus plantation. They had several children, some of whom still lived with them. The older children were hired out by the master, Edward Ross, to farmers who needed slave labor but who could not afford to buy slaves. In 1820, Old Rit had another baby. There was no record made of the date of birth of the child, because neither Old Rit nor her husband, Ben, could read or write. Like most people who live close to the land and who have neither clock nor calendar, they measured time by the sun, dividing it roughly into sun up, sun high, sun down. The year was not divided by months, by the seasons. It was separated into seed time, cotton blossom time, harvest, Christmas. One year was distinguished from another by its happenings. Its big, memorable occurrences: the year of the big storm, the year of the early frost or the long drought, the year the old master died, the year the young master was born. Aldred and Ben decided that they would call this new baby Aradmida, a name that would be ultimately shorted to Minta. Yeah, it's Minta or Minty. That's weird. This would be her basket name or pet name and would be used until she grew older. They would call her Harriet. This year would be separated from the others by referring to it as the year Minty was born. News, good or bad, traveled swiftly through the quarters. All the slaves that knew that Old Rit had another baby. That night they left their own cabins, moving like shadows, pausing now and then to listen, always expecting to hear the sound of hoof beats, loud and furious, along the road, and a sound that meant the patrollers were hunting another runaway. Only they added an extra stable to the word, making it patroller. Then, moving quickly, they slipped inside Ben's cabin to look at the new baby. They arrived in groups, 2 or 3 at a time, and stood looking down at the baby. It was a girl. They already knew that but they asked whether it was a boy or a girl out of politeness, and asked what her name would be, though they knew that too. Dang, these people know a lot. Girls were not worth much and Old Rit already had a passel of children. But they did not say this. They suggested, my bad, I'm sorry, tactfully that Old Rit had better seen to it than this new girl baby was trained as a cook or a weaver or a seamstress, whatever that is. Perhaps she could take care of children, be a child's nurse. That way she would never become a common field hand. They admired the baby briefly. They asked after the mother's health, and then lingered on, squatting down in front of the open fire, talking. The talk around the fire was about the new overseer, about the corn crop, about the weather, but it ended with the subject of freedom, just as it always did. The bold one, young, strong, and freedom lay to the north, and the one could obtain it if one could but get there. A hush fell over the cabin, and uneasiness entered the room. It seemed to reach the sleeping children huddled on the old blankets. Sorry for that. In the corner, for they stirred in their sleep. They were all silent for a moment, remembering the ragged, half-starved runaways that they had been brought back in chairs, branded with an R, or the ears cropped. Remembering how they had seen them whipped and sent south with the chain gang. Then another of the slaves, squatted by the fire, broke the silence. They used a long word, manumission. It was a word the master used. It was a promise that had been made to all of them. If they were faithfully and hardworking, the master would set them free. Manumit they then them when he died. Someone pointed out that such things did not and could happen. There were free Negroes living on their own cabins on the edge of the woods, not far away from the plantation. Because these people were free, their children were born free. This was said with a covert glance at the tiny new baby, Minta or Minty, who lay close by old Ritz's side in a corner of the cabin. One of the sad, dispirited slaves said the freedom lay only in death. The bold ones said this was not true. They said you could run away to get the north and be free. Slaves were disappearing all the time from the nearby farms and plantations. True, some of them were caught, brought back, and sold south, but many of them were not. Quite often, the master and the overseer came back without the runaways. They said they had sold them, but this was not necessarily true. Surely some of these young prime field hands, glossy-skinned, supple jointed, surely some of these strong young men must have reached the north. Yes, the other said, but how could one know? Excuse me. How be certain? Why did none of them ever come back? Why were they never seen again? It was cold in the north. Perhaps they died on the way, died of the cold and hunger. Who could possibly know? The uncertainty and uneasiness filled the cabin again. More and more slaves were disappearing. Edward Broadus, the master, was selling them off. Each time the trader came to Maryland, came to Cambridge, the master sold another group of slaves. Nowadays, it seemed as though he were raising slaves just to sell them, breeding them just like the farmers breeded cows or sheep. They were doing the same thing on the other plantations in Dorchester County. The Stewart plantation and the Ross plantation. They were all selling slaves. Things were not going well with the masters. They needed money. The Georgia trader paid high prices, and if the masters were in debt, or a crop had failed, or they had been gambling heavily and losing, they sold off another lot of slaves. Man, I'm dumb because I can't read fast. And geez, man, why can't people just not sell slaves? Why do they even have slaves? Like, people are too lazy to do their own work? Like if you agree, guys. And put in the comments your own opinion about slaves and stuff like that. But anyway, I'm going to finish here. When the slaves learned that they were to be sold, they ran away. They always knew when the decision had been reached to sell them. They were afraid of the living death that awaited them in the rice fields on the great cotton plantations, the sugar plantations in the deep south, and so ran away. To the slaves, those words sold south, sold down the river, carried the sound of doom. The master used it as a threat to recalcitrant slaves. I can't read today. Not worth a poo-poo. The runaways that were caught and brought back were immediately sold south as a punishment for running away. Damn, these people can't not sell slaves. Like, what the fuck's their problem? Thus, the action on both sides was like a circle that went around and around, never ending. The master kept selling slaves because he needed money. Maybe if you weren't gambling and watching porn, maybe you would have money. The slaves, learning that they were about to be sold, would run away. I would run away too. The number of runaways from Maryland kept increasing, especially from the eastern shore, where the river and Cubs offered a direct route to the north, where the Choptank River curved and twisted in the northeasterly course, the whole length of the state and all the way to the Delaware. That night in the quarter, one of the bold young slaves said if one could get hold of a boat, and there were boats everywhere, rowboats, gunning skiffs, punts, because almost every plantation was near a cove or a creek or an inlet, one could get away. This whispering about freedom, about runaways, about manumission went on every night in windowless slave cabins all over the South. Slaves everywhere knew what happened in Washington, Boston, New York. Come on, page, turn. Norfolk, Baltimore. If it dealt with the subject of slavery, they knew it sometimes before the master heard about it. The close communication, the rapid exchange of information among the slaves, troubled and distributed the masters, they said, half in a joke, half seriously. That news seemed to travel down the wind, or else that it pulsed along from plantation to plantation, traveling over the triangle of grapevines and honeysuckle that grew in the woods. My voice is all raspy today. I am very sorry. I'm reading slow, but my voice hurts. On the plantation of Edward Brodus, the slaves knew when the Georgia trader arrived in Cambridge, the nearest city, and rented a room in the tavern. They knew it before Brodus knew. The trader sent out printed notices of his arrival. Though most of the slaves could not read, there were a few who could, and they told the others what it said on the trader's handbills. Will pay top price for prime field hands. On the night that Harriet, who would be known as Arminta or Minta Ross, was born, those words on the handbills were ever present in the minds of the slaves gathered in Old Ritz cabin. Before they said good night, they looked at the baby again. Someone said quietly, "Best thing to do is make sure she works in the big house. Sew or cook or weave, maybe be a nurse." Old Rit drew the baby closer to her side, thinking field and not sun and long rows of cotton and the overseer's whip. Minty would never be a field hand if she had anything to do with it. Then the slaves slipped out of the cabin as quietly as they entered it, one at a time, bare feet making no sound at all on the hard, smooth ground outside. Sorry. In that same year, 1820, the year of the Missouri Compromise, Thomas Garrett and his wife, Sarah, both Quakers, I think that's Quakers, I'm pretty sure, moved from Darby, Pennsylvania to the Wilmington, Delaware. Both of these people would years later know and admire Harriet Ross. Though they would know her by a different name, that year John Brown, who was 20 years old, married the widow Lusk, a short, plain-looking woman. He was in the tanning business in Hudson, Ohio, and the time of his marriage. Years later, he too would know and admire Harriet Ross. that is the end of chapter 1, quarter. I am very sorry, I'm a very slow reader. I'm getting very sick, but this book is actually getting quite interesting. This is my very first time reading and my very first video. So, like, subscribe, turn on post notifications so you don't miss another video. That's all I can tell you. I will also be posting Fortnite videos on my channel and stuff like that. My very first video, I'm trying to get to 5 subscribers. It'd really help if you could subscribe. Thank you very much. I will see you later.